I'm sure you can all hear me. So, number one, a hearty welcome. It's wonderful, wonderful being with you. Although we're not together in person, but we will this year, God willing, as opposed to the past 2 years where we couldn't be together as families and friends get together as we usually do for the Seder and for the holiday. This year, thank God, we can finally be together again in person.
Yes, Valerie, Cindy Giordano, or somebody. You can't. It says muted. Yeah.
How is that?
Okay, go ahead.
Can you hear me?
Yes, continue.
Okay, so thank God we're going to be together with our families and friends once again, as in years before, and we'll celebrate Pesach together as it should be. Let me just open this with a Dvar Torah. Dvar Torah I actually heard from Rabbi Yisrael Meir Lau, who was the former chief rabbi of Israel. I mean, a tremendous scholar. And he says this about Pesach. He says this about Passover. He says it's interesting, and I'm actually translating it from the Hebrew. He says it's interesting to note that we specifically call this holiday Pesach or Passover. And we refer to it as the Pesach Seder, right? The intermediate days are referred to as Chol HaMoed Pesach, the intermediate days of Pesach. The 7th and the 8th days of Pesach are 78 days of Pesach. Shvi'i Shel Pesach, 7th day of Pesach, Achron Shel Pesach, the last day of Pesach. And then there is an entire Talmudic tractate, a volume, dealing specifically with the laws and teachings of Passover. And this Talmudic tractate is called Pesachim. So again, Pesach. So on the other hand, Pesach, the word Pesach for Passover is never mentioned as such in the Torah. The Torah never mentions the word Pesach. In the Torah it says, when referred to as the holiday of Pesach, referred to as Chag HaMatzot, the holiday of the matzahs. In other words, that's not called the Passover holiday. Even when it comes to the Shalosh Regalim, which is the 3 pilgrim festivals, which we are commanded in those days, of course, to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem 3 times a year, and to be in God's house in the Holy Temple. Again, this commandment says Shalosh Pe'amim b'shana, 3 times a year. Everyone should be in Jerusalem, of course, in the chosen, the house which God will choose. And it specifically says Chag HaMatzot, the holiday of the matzah, not Pesach. It doesn't say. It says Sukkot, Shavuot, and when it comes to Passover, it says Chag HaMatzot. Only when it comes to the Paschal offering or the sacrifice do we call it Korban Pesach, the Paschal offering. Then the word Pesach. So what do we see from here? We see from here, says Rabbi Long, that the ultimate expression here, we see the ultimate expression of love and affection and the close relationship that exists between God and his people. And that's also one of the reasons when we read the Shir HaShirim during the Sabbath of the Chol HaMoed, when there is such thing, where this year there isn't. So we recite the Song of Songs, because the Song of Songs, we all know, is really an allegory. It is it represents the ultimate relationship, the loving relationship that exists between God and his people. So in the Torah, God calls this holiday Chag HaMatzot, the holiday of matzah. Why? So said Rabbi Lau, and this is in order to praise, to give praise to the Israelites when he commended them to leave everything behind and leave Mitzrayim in a hurry, right? They didn't ask any questions. They didn't ask why, when. They had complete bitachon, they had complete trust in God. And they were on their way. They left in such a hurry, in fact, that even the dough did not have the time to rise, and they ate matzahs. So again, they had complete trust in God's salvation. God, on the other hand, doesn't forget this, didn't forget it. And we see it in the book of Jeremiah. Yirmiyahu says, in the name of God, he says, Zacharti lach chesed ne'urayich. I will always remember you for the kindness of your youth. What do you do? He says, Lech tech acharai bamidbar be'eretz lo zerua. When you followed me in the wilderness, in a barren place, you followed me, you didn't ask any questions. So I love you for it. I need to reward you for it, So we call it Chag HaPesach in order to emphasize and show our gratitude to God for his kindness with us when he passed over, Mishum Shepasach, when he passed over the homes of our ancestors in Egypt during the plague, the last plague of the firstborn. And you see this love affair that goes on. Israel wants to praise God. God wants to praise Israel. And this is again, turning to the Song of Songs. This is the wonderful interpretation of the words, Ani ledodi v'dodi. I am my beloved's, and my beloved is mine, So again, we call this holiday Chag HaPesach, the Passover holiday of Pesach, in order to praise and to thank God for all the good which he has bestowed upon us. In turn, God refers to this holiday as Chag HaMatzot, in order to express his love and his praise for his people. So that's a wonderful, wonderful Drator, and I thought I would share it with you. I'd like to speak a little bit about let's talk a little bit about the preparation for Pesach. Because Pesach is not an easy holiday to prepare for. And what I would like to do is, I would like to talk to you a little bit about the hachanot, the preparation for Pesach, which are not easy, especially not for the women, certainly. And how can we apply the laws and the traditions of Passover to our lives? So first and foremost, preparation. Everything that's worthwhile needs preparation. In fact, even services need preparation. In olden days, the Talmud tells us that the early Hasidim, the early sages, used to come to the synagogue an hour before services. Why? In order to prepare themselves to stand before God and pray before God. It needs preparation. You can't come out of bed and just go. You can't come out of bed and just go play football, for that matter. You need preparation. When God gave the Torah at Mount Sinai, he was very specific. He says, "V'heyu nechonim laboker." Give you 3 days of preparation, and you have to be prepared. You have to be ready. So how do we get ready? How do we get ready? So preparation is always a very important part of anything and everything that we do in our private lives, in our lives as a whole. We need preparation. Talk about freedom. Pesach. We'll talk a little later about the different names of Pesach. Also, aside from Chag HaMatzot and Chag and Pesach, it's also known as Chag HaCheirut, because in the liturgy, when we pray in the liturgy, we refer to Passover as Zman Cheirutenu, as the season of our freedom, of our redemption. And it's also known as Chag HaAviv, the holiday of spring. And because in the Torah, it's known as Chodesh Aviv. This month is known as Chodesh Aviv because it's spring. Everything begins to bloom and everything is green. Now, preparation takes a lot of cleaning. There's a lot of work, tremendous amount of work. So we clean the house. We, on the night before the Seder, this night will be Thursday night, we go around, we have what we call Bedikat Chametz. Bedikat Chametz means what? We search for the Chametz. We take 10 pieces of bread, we spread them around all places which we may have eaten Chametz. Now, there's a reason, there are different reasons, never a good reason as to why 10. Of course, 10 corresponding to 10 commandments, but here we're looking for something that we don't need. We're looking for something that is chametz. We're looking for something that we need to nullify, and the next day we need to burn it. And so when it comes to the chametz, how do we apply this to our lives, to our personal lives? And there is a term we call cheshbon hanefesh. It's called introspection. B'dika. We need to search within ourselves. Search. What chametz do we have? What chametz have we get? What chametz don't we need anymore? What part of our lives should be nullified? The things allowed we do, or we're addicted to, whatever, that we need to nullify. And then the next day to burn. We burn the chametz. The next day we burn the chametz. And again, the chametz represents something that we don't need. Let me just go over for a second on the chametz, and then I'll get back to the selling and everything else. It's interesting that we just began reading the third book of the Torah, Leviticus, Vayikra, talks about the different offerings, and it's a manual for the Kohanim as to how to represent us in the Holy Temple. In this book, right at the beginning, it says, listen to this, and when you present an offering of meal baked in the oven, it shall be of choice flour, unleavened cakes with oil mixed in, or unleavened wafers spread with oil. Then it says, no meal offering that you offer to God or to the Lord shall be made with leaven. Again, with leaven. Why? For you must not turn into smoke any leaven as an offering by the fire to the Lord. So, question is, what is it about the chametz? Why does God, from here we see that God somehow detests leavened offerings? Why? Why this ancient obsession with the chametz? So it was left to the sages of the rabbinic period to somehow speculate on the reason for the prohibition of chametz. In the Talmud, it says that Rabbi Alexandri wrote this short prayer found in the Talmud, and we say this when we burn and when we nullify. The prayer goes this way. It says, Master of the universe, it is well known to you that our will is to perform your will. So what prevents us? The yeast in the dough. The yeast in the dough. So building on this theme, there's a meditation that you'll find in some prayer books. And the meditation goes this way. It says, our God, Eloheinu v'lo Avotenu, our God and God of our ancestors, just as you have removed all chametz, all leaven, from my home and from my ownership, you should not own, of course, so may it be your will. By the way, this is the reason you sell the chametz, because you're not allowed to own chametz. So you sell the chametz. I mean, the rabbis act as the representatives, the intermediary, and we get the so-called power of attorney to sell the chametz on your behalf, and we sell it to a non-Jew who can own chametz, So again, our God and God of our ancestors, just as I removed all chametz from my home and from my ownership, so may it be your will that I merit the removal of the evil inclination from my heart. So, what does it tell you? That according to this view, chametz is not simply leavened foodstuff. Rather, it is a visible manifestation of the Yetzer Hara, the evil inclination that resides within us. There's a quote here from Philo of Alexandria, a metaphor. It says, just as leaven is banned, why? Because it's puffed up. So too must we guard against the self-righteousness that puffs us up with false pride. So leaven, according to the rabbis, is something that represents haughtiness, being overly proud of yourself, ego. So leavened bread, of course, is puffed up. The dough rises. And this represents our egos. And, something we're overly proud of ourselves, our ego. So every once in a while, God says, you know what? Why so big? Why do you think of yourself so big? There comes a time, at least once a year, flatten yourself. Go down to the matzah. Matzah represents humility. So the rabbinic sages transform chametz and matzah from ordinary foods into symbols of great religious significance. So again, chametz, according to the rabbis, represents ego, puffed up. It represents arrogance. Matzah, on the other hand, represents humility. Chametz, leaven, symbolizes us in not such a good state, Matzah symbolizes the finest qualities of the human spirit. And this, my friends, is one of the messages of one of the many messages of our Passover observance. Um, we when we prepare for Passover, we have to strive. When we search and when we nullify, we have to strive to remove all the chametz, both physical and metaphysical, from our homes and from our hearts. No. So let's go back for a minute to the preparations and a little bit about the Seder, the order, and how can we apply this to our lives, to our personal lives, the different symbols, the different traditions, the different laws. So again, we need to prepare. Preparation is a very important part, whether you prepare for Shabbos. As the rabbi said, that etzem hachana, the fact that you are preparing, that you are taking great pride in preparing for such a holiday, in preparing for Shabbat, that in itself, the hachana itself is a great mitzvah. And then, of course, we part of it, of course, is the cleaning of the house, and that represents, how many times do you hear when it comes to our personal lives, you got a clean house. I got a clean house. What does it mean? What does it mean I got a clean house, right? It means more than just physically. We have to clean a house. You hear that expression again and again and again. Also, King Solomon in Ecclesiastes, he says, "You call yadechanikim, your hands should always be clean. Clean, not only physically, again, spiritually." So we search, and of course the Bible tells us, let us search our ways, and let us research. What chametz do we have in us? Physical chametz, spiritual chametz that we don't need anymore. We don't need. We had it last year. It didn't do us any good. Let's search what it is that we don't need, and then let's nullify it. And nullifying is not enough. Let's make it. It says, the prayer says, it should be ke'afra de ara. It should be like the dust of the earth. Nothing. That's it. And the Torah tells us something very interesting. It says, when it comes to evil, you should burn the evil mikirbecha, from within you. It says, "V'alta hara mikirbecha." Bi'ur, leva'er, means to burn. To burn. And of course, you shouldn't own any chametz. And this is, of course, the selling of the chametz. Certain things you shouldn't own anyway, you should sell them anyway, And then we have, of course, the Seder. And the Seder, in Hebrew they say, Akol Beseder, is everything in order? Is everything okay? And so we should be in order, not out of order, not out of line. Everything should be Beseder, just like the Seder. There's a certain order that we follow, and so we need to follow the Seder of life, so to speak. And the first thing we do is we make Kiddush. We make Kiddush. And Kiddush, as you know, is sanctification from the word kadosh. And we sanctify the holidays and the Shabbat over wine. And we know why. Wine is the liquid of joy. And here we have to drink 4 cups of wine. We'll talk about that in a little bit later. But how do we apply this Kedusha to our lives? Very simple. In a couple of weeks, we'll read a portion in which God expects us, Kedoshim Tihiyu. I want you to be holy. Why? Because I'm your God and I'm holy. So I want you to emulate me. But holy, kadosh, the word kadosh, according to our rabbis, doesn't only mean holy, but it means pushim teyu. In other words, you have to separate yourselves. What do you separate yourselves from in order to achieve some sort of holiness? Anything and everything that isn't good for you. Anything that doesn't sanctify your name in God's name. Stay away from. Stay away from. And so, and by the way, you know whether it is the Kiddush for Shabbat, whether it is the Kiddush for the holidays, we always refer back, Zecher liYetziat Mitzrayim. This is a remembrance of our exodus from Egypt. Why? When we make Kiddush over Shabbat in such a joyous day, and we say Kibanu B'Chadov, Zecher, why do we have to remember the Exodus? And the answer is very simple, because if it were not for the Exodus, we would have not had the Shabbat. We would not have come to Mount Sinai. We would have not received the Torah. And therefore, we wouldn't have had the commandments regarding the Shabbat and the holidays. So everything goes back to Yetziat Mitzrayim. Because if it were not for the Exodus from Egypt, Shabbat wouldn't have been here. Because we didn't get the Torah and the holidays. And the commandments regarding the holidays. So Yetziat Mitzrayim plays a tremendous, tremendous part in our lives. And, I said yesterday in my sermon that Mitzrayim also comes from the word Meitzarim. Meitzarim means narrow places. In fact, there's a psalm that King David begins, and we sing it in the Hallel. It's called Min HaMeitzar Karatia, the word Meitzar. Meitzar means out of distress. It's like being in a straitjacket. You can't move, And how many times do we find ourselves in this position? So resisting. Are we free? I mean, we may be free in the fact that we're not slaves, but we're all somehow enslaved to something. Whether it's covered, whether it's money, whether it's material, whether it's anything that we enslave for. We're addicted. We're addicted to something. And this is something that we need to get rid of. So in order to be free, totally free, really feel that freedom, feel that cherut, we have to also nullify everything that isn't good in our personal lives, We open up the door for hospitality and we say, halach ma'anya. It is the bread of affliction which our ancestors ate we're free. We still do it. And as a sign of hospitality, of course, Pesach is probably the holiday, which nobody should be alone. Nobody should be alone. Some people can afford it. It's an expensive holiday. Some people are just alone. It's the Friday evening I spoke about the Agnon's, Shai Agnon's beautiful, beautiful story about the difference of when we say halachma, when we welcome everyone who wants to come in and eat. Let all those who are hungry come and eat. And then it says, Kol ditzrich, and all those who are needy come and spend Passover with us. There is a distinction, at first you say, why the repetition? But then Agnon, the great Nobel laureate, Shai Agnon, It says that the repetition is that there is a distinction between the hungry and the needy. The hungry are those who really don't have enough food. And in olden days, not everybody could afford that. It doesn't matter whether Shabbat or Pesach, they couldn't. And it tells the story of a shamish who is walking home, a caretaker in those days of the synagogue, poor person in the shtetl, is walking home the first night of the Seder, and he's all alone. And he had enough money, a couple of rubles, to buy some meager food for Pesach, just a couple of matzahs and anything else. And behind him walks a wealthy widow. And this is her first year without a husband. And yet she could afford it. She could afford it. She had the finest candelabras, finest silverware, and finest Passover dishes. And she looks at the shamash, she says, you know what? I'm alone, you're alone. Let's spend Pesach together. Let's spend the Seder together. And Agnon says, here's a perfect example of the hungry and the needy. The poor sexton, the poor Shabbos, the caretaker, he was hungry. He didn't have anything. And he was alone. But the widow, who was never alone, she's childless, always had a wonderful Pesach with her husband, and always invited who knows how many guests. This year she's alone. But she found somebody who is needy. She found somebody who is hungry. She was needy. She needed company. She needed someone to spend the Seder night with. So Agnon says this is the distinction and the repetition of let all those who are hungry come and eat. And then call the tzrich, let all those who are needy come and spend Pesach with us. Because you should not be alone on Pesach. You should never be alone in the Seder. You should not be alone in Seder. We go on and we say, that, and it teaches us, by the way, a great lesson in hospitality. We should all be disciples of Abraham and Sarah, who epitomized, that personifies hospitality. And then we wash our hands, and this time without a blessing. But again, you got to keep your hands clean. And that's something that we should apply to our personal lives, whether it's hygiene or just keep your hands clean. In other words, don't do anything you shouldn't do. Kalpas. Kalpas is known as a green vegetable, right? Because this is the holiday of the spring and everything becomes green, everything grows. And by eating, kalpas can be, by the way, if you look at the Seder place, we'll talk about the Seder place in a minute, the kalpas is a green vegetable. Sometimes it's celery, sometimes it's, parsley, and sometimes it's potato. In other words, kalpas represents our everlasting gratitude to God for giving us the vegetables, for sustaining us. But it's green. And we have to remember one thing, that the grass is not always greener on the other side. We shouldn't take things for granted. And by the way, during the time that the Holy Temple was in existence, all the banquets, so to speak, in the temple, the Seudot, it started with what we know today as hors d'oeuvres. So kalpas was part of the hors d'oeuvres. Yachatz, we break the middle matzah. We leave for the Africa. We break the middle matzah. We leave half for the hamotzi later on for the meal, and half of it we hide. We leave for the Afikoman, which we hide, because as we all know, Pesach is the children's holiday. We do everything and anything to just to just encourage the children to ask, to question. And the Seder plate, I call it, it's like a show and tell, So when you say the kalpas, it's green vegetable, and explain. Yachatz, when do we eat the afikomen? Afikomen we eat after the meal, just before the benching, just before the grace after meal. And so we have to keep the attention of the children. We have to keep them awake. So by enticing them with a gift, if you find the afikomen, you'll get a wonderful, wonderful gift. This gives them the encouragement to stay up for another hour, another two, because they go on another afikomen hunt in order to get the gift. The yachatz, again, is to teach us a wonderful lesson. The wonderful lesson is that we may have food, but a poor person doesn't know when his next piece of bread doesn't know where it's coming from, doesn't know when he will have that next piece of bread. So if he has a piece of bread, a whole piece of bread, chances are that he's worried, what am I going to have for dinner? This is now breakfast. Just in case I'm not going to have anything to eat, let me break that piece of bread. And let me eat half now. And let me leave the other half of the rest for later. And this is, again, to teach us a very profound lesson, that we shouldn't take anything for granted just because we have a whole piece of bread. There are so many people who don't have that piece of bread. Look at what's going on today. Look at the hunger. Look at the homelessness. It teaches us to take care of the other, take care of those who are less fortunate. And of course, Magid tell a story. The Haggadah, the Hagid, to tell. What are we actually telling? We're telling the story of the Exodus. We're telling the story of the Exodus. And when we tell you the story of the Exodus, again, it's geared towards the children. Everything is geared towards children. Because if you look at back at the book of Exodus in the Parsha of Bo, which really tells us all about the Pesach and what we shouldn't do, and the first month, the commandment of this being the first of all months, biblically, the month of Nisan, it says, and what happens when your child or your children or your youngsters ask you tomorrow, not today, not 2,000, 3,000 years ago, but today, 3,300 years later, what happens when your child turns to you and he says, why are we doing all this? Will you be able to answer? So in essence, somebody said that the Haggadah is really a textbook. It's a wonderful textbook. And it records our history. And the children are asking. And we encourage the children to ask. And when they ask, will we be able to give them the right answer? We tell them the story. It's a story. The story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of what took place before the Exodus, what led up to the Exodus, the enslavement, the bitterness. And we come to wash our hands, right? To wash our hands. And once again, we should keep our hands clean. I hope I'm doing okay. Okay. Motzi matzah, right. Wash our hands, and then, of course, make a motzi. We make a motzi, and again, we thank God for the bread. We thank God for the food, which He has given us and He gives us, and pray that He continue to sustain us, And of course, we remind ourselves of the Hillel sandwich, And then, of course, we eat the Passover meal, and we thank God for the food. We thank God for the food. And then we bless, of course, we thank God for the food, and Hallel, we praise God. And at the end is Nir Tzah. We sing, we ask God that everything that we have done today, whether it's a Pesach and the Seder, should be acceptable. All of our prayers should be accepted, and God should accept all of our prayers, and certainly we should have a wonderful year. The Hasidim, by the way, I want you to know that being based upon the fact that Nisan is known as HaChodesh, and the commandment was during this month, the month of the Exodus from Egypt, which is Nisan, is the first of all months for the Jewish people. Biblically, we count the months from the month of Nisan, and which is the Bible doesn't really say, don't tell us the name of the months that came later in Babylonia, but it tells us on the first of the month, in the second month, or the 10th of the seventh month, or the first of the seventh month. It's Rosh Hashanah and so forth, because you count from the month of Nisan. And so the Hasidim, because it's the head of the year, so they used to say Agut Yom Tov and Agut Yo on Rosh Chodesh Nisan. They wish you a happy new year. So this here again, we pray to God that we should once again be inscribed and sealed for a wonderful, wonderful year. This is a time to give tzedakah, to share with those who are less fortunate, as I said before, and therefore, prior to Passover, about 2, 3, 4 weeks, right after Purim or on Purim, we collect what we call ma'ot chitin. Ma'ot chitin is money for bread, money for Pesach. Because, again, not everybody can afford it. So we go around and we ask for people to give donations so they can spend, so the others can celebrate Pesach just as well as we do. Why don't I just, let me stop right over here. And before we go on to the next, let me just ask if there are any questions or any comments.
I have one question.
Yes.
It sounds so strange, but there's a thing where we got our freedom, we're leaving Mitzrayim, and we got our freedom. But what happens to the women that get Pesach, get ready for Pesach?
You know what? I mean, it's a very good question. As I said before, especially for the ladies, it's a lot of work. So I said before, I mean, I heard it said that although we're celebrating freedom, although we're celebrating me Avdut Lecherut, Pesach is a celebration of going from being servants and slave to freedom. It's the other way around for for ladies, really. They have to work hard. They have to work hard. But you know what? Once you sit down to the Seder and you look at what you have done and look what you have accomplished, there's a certain amount of feeling good.
It's worth it. It's totally worth it.
What is it now?
I said it's totally worth it. It just startles me what's going on.
You said it's totally worth it?
Yes.
That's true. That's true. I mean, but however, let's go back to the hachana. Let's go back to the preparations.
Okay.
When you prepare for something, when you're going to celebrate such a holiday as Pesach, you need to prepare for it, not only physically but spiritually.
Oh, right.
100%. So that's part of the preparation. That's part of the word hikonu, be prepared for this time. When God told the people of Israel to be prepared for the receiving of the Torah. During a Seder, usually there's a diverse group of people sitting around the table. Some are familiar with the story of the Exodus and very comfortable with the language of the Haggadah, and others aren't. Some are focused on the ceremony. Others are probably waiting for dinner. It's not there, but you remember the one thing. Pesach is not, or a Jewish holiday is, they try to kill us, we won, let's eat. That's not what it's all about, Yes, I understand. We all understand that there are people, that are children, and they're probably elderly people. And so you at the beginning, until you get to the meal, at least you should recite and sing the highlights. The highlights. And later on, ask me the question, what are the highlights? And somebody told me there's a 10-minute Seder, if you want it. But that's the highlight.
10 minutes?
Yeah. Well, it's a 10-minute Seder. I mean, in 10 minutes, we can tell you exactly what to do, what you have to do, or what you should do, or what you should choose to do,
I like it longer than that. Goodness.
Well, we'll talk about it also. I mean, that's what it is, So, look, not everybody can read it in Hebrew. So a great Seder, really, to have a wonderful Seder, a great Seder, an ideal Seder, a productive Seder, the Seder has to be combined with conversation, learning, imagination, questions, fun. And we need to engage all those present. In fact, not only to engage, but we need to challenge them to think about this story, about our Zeicher, this collective memory, and how, in fact, we are connected to the past and the future, So remember that when the Torah commands us regarding a holiday and regarding the holiday of Pesach, God doesn't say, this is one Pesach and that's it. The emphasis is, Leman yed'u da'otechem, so that your future generations shall know that I have taken your ancestors out of Egypt, what led to it, what they had to go through. It's not just come and sit down and eat, And by the way, there's no accident that early in the Seder, we speak about 4 types of children. We talk about number 4, present the Seder. Actually, the 4 children are not really children. They don't have to be children, They're participants, But they ask different types of questions. And so they deserve different type of answers based on their knowledge and temperament. And no question, by the way, is too small or stupid or outrageous. The only question that is the question you haven't asked yet, So it's our job, the people who lead the Seder, to inspire the participants to ask questions and to encourage them, Question is, and this is what this is all about, how do we make the Passover Seder and meaningful? And meaningful, I mean two words. Meaningful, filled with meaning, And, the Torah tells us, in chapter 12 of Exodus, again, it can be reduced to three words, really. And they are Pesach, Matzah, Umaror. Pesach, Matzah, and bitter herbs. See, our ancestors gathered on the eve of the original Pesach, Passover, in Egypt, out of Egypt, and followed God's instructions. What did they do? Yesterday yesterday was Shabbat Gadol, the great Shabbat, and this was their last Shabbat in Egypt, and they were asked to take a lamb, one lamb per household, and that shows you how important the family is. Celebrate avotav, once per household, and tie it to the bedpost. And the miracle was that the Egyptians saw it. Remember, the lamb was their god. They worshipped the lamb. The Egyptians saw their god tied to the bedpost.
Couldn't do anything.
They could do nothing. They could do nothing. And so, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. So the original Pesach, following God's instructions, sacrificing a lamb, and they roasted it, and then eating it with matzah and bitter herbs. That was it. And after placing its blood, and then after placing its blood on the doorposts of their homes, because that's what they commandment. So if we look back at this Pesach, this was not a Pesach celebration, a celebratory meal. But the night of Pesach is known as Leil Shimurim. It's a night of protection. God protects us. Because remember, the angel of death went through the entire land of Egypt and smote all the firstborn except for the Jewish people. Why? Because we were commanded to put blood on our doorposts, and God protected us from the angel of that. Remember the passage in Yagada that says, and that's one of the reasons, by the way, that if you look at it, Moses' name is really not mentioned in the Haggadah, although he was the one who was sent by God to tell Pharaoh again and again and again, "Shalach et ami vayavduni," let my people go so they can worship me in the wilderness. In the wilderness, God, the Haggadah makes it a point to emphasize that God says, I took you out from Egypt. Not by messenger, lo al yedei malach, velo al yedei shaliach, ela, not by messenger, not by an angel, but ela HaKadosh Baruch Hu b'chvodo v'atzmo. But the Holy One, blessed be He, personally took you out of Egypt, and make no mistake about it. Yes, Moses, was God's emissary, no question about it. But it was God, b'chvodo v'atzmo, God Himself took you out from Egypt. Maybe the real reason for the meal that was to keep people indoors as God passed through Egypt and, of course, smote the Egyptian firstborn. Now, a little bit of a history. After Egypt, the Pesach meal became really a commemoration. It was an opportunity for us, to recall and to relive our liberation, our freedom. To relive and to remember that moment when our ancestors became an independent nation. Remember that. They came out of Egypt as Bnei Yisrael, as the children of Israel, the Israelites. 7 weeks later, they were at the foot of Mount Sinai, receiving the Torah, and thus becoming Am Yisrael. Now we're a bona fide nation. Bona fide nation needs a constitution, needs laws and regulations, and this is what the Torah, this is represented by the Torah. So now we're Am Yisrael. We're Am Yisrael. So the moment we became an independent nation, now for centuries, they offered sacrifice, just as their ancestors did. Remember, and they told the story while, story of Pesach and Yetziat Mitzrayim, the Exodus from Egypt. And they, so to speak, munched them while they're doing this, while they're telling the story. They have matzah and bitter herbs. That's what the thing is. That's the thing. That matzah and bitter herbs. So that Seder, in essence, consisted in those days of 3 parts: eating, asking, and explaining. Now, eventually, the temple was destroyed. This took place when the temple was in existence. We celebrated Pesach with a Paschal offering, with a Paschal lamb. The temple was destroyed, and the Pesach offering could no longer be made. And so the eating became, so to speak, a postscript to the asking and the explanation. Nowadays, of course, we ask questions, and then we explain what we're doing. And finally, of course, we eat a good meal. But at the end of the day, at the end of the evening, the Seder is the same. Because the Mishnah tells us in the name of Rabbi Gamliel, and we read it in the Haggadah, whoever has not discussed these 3 things, specifically on Pesach Eve, has not kept the Seder properly. And what are the 3 things that we have to discuss? You see, because they are Torah ordained. They're Pesach, the Paschal lamb, matzah, and the bitter herbs. Remembering how they embittered our lives, So, my friends, in essence, in a sense, that is the essence of the Seder. No more and no less. Of course, there's a lot more going on at the Seder, 4 cups of wine, of course. And, we don't have a lot of time. I'd like to really get into it a little more. This is sort of an introduction. We drink 4 cups of wine, and they correspond to the 4 expressions of redemption by God to the people of Israel. I shall take you out, I shall redeem you, I shall, go tzeiti, v'itzauti, v'ga'alti. 4 expressions of freedom by God to the people of Israel. And then we read the passage, our history. My father was a wandering Aramean. Look at it, Laban. He wanted to uproot everything, And of course, we go to the 10 plagues and Dayenu. And of course, the ceremonial meal has to follow, the Seder plate. But according to Rabbi Gamliel, one has not fulfilled the essentials of the Seder night unless you have stopped to consider the meaning of specifically these three symbols. And we point, Pesach, Matzah, and Maror. Why Pesach, Matzah, and Maror? I saw a beautiful, beautiful explanation to this by the late, great chief rabbi of the British Kingdom, Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sachs of blessed memory. And he writes, listen to this. He writes, and I quote, "The Pesach is a symbol of freedom. It was only when Israel were willing to sacrifice the lamb, which was one of the God of the Egyptians, that they began the journey to freedom. Only then," says Rabbi Sachs so beautifully. Maror, he says, is a symbol of slavery, bitter herbs, bitterness. It's not enough on this night to celebrate freedom, he says. We must never forget the bitterness of slavery and oppression. Then, and even now, as we speak, look at what's going on in the world today. Israel is under fire. Homicide, suicide bombings every day. Look at what goes on in Ukraine and other places in the world. And the matzah, he says, is a combination of the two. It was the bread of affliction and slavery, but it was also the only food, he says, we took with us when we fled from Egypt into the wilderness, So it challenges us. He says, pardon the pun, but matzah has two sides. One side challenges us to compare slavery and freedom, and to recognize the other side, and to recognize our ability to choose. Our ability to choose. Are we free? Somebody says, what is your definition of freedom? And he says, freedom is being able to do everything and anything I wanted to do. However, there's one problem. I don't know what I want. So are you free or are you not free? So these symbols are in the heart of our celebration. And more than just Rabbi Gamliel's reading and explanation, we need to pause and consider what we can learn from these three symbols. We need to use them as a tool, so to speak, for telling the story of the Exodus. It's, as I said before, a kind of show and tell. And we need to allow them to inspire questions. Once again, what does it mean to be a slave? What does it mean to be free? Questions like, is there still slavery in the world today? Or is the slavery merely a metaphor? To what extent are we slaves? What are the sources of bitterness in our lives? Think about it. And in the lives of others. How can we sensitize ourselves to such bitterness? How do we balance freedom with a sense of responsibility to community, to God, and to the world? Is our freedom the same as the one in the Haggadah and the scriptures? These are the questions you should ask. And it leads to a wonderful, wonderful discussion. But most important, why are we still telling the same story after so many centuries. So let me just tell you what a Seder shouldn't be. A Seder should not be an excuse for an elaborate meal, although it's a wonderful thing. Good foods, the knedlach and everything else. Enjoy your dinner. But we have to remember that we didn't get together just to eat. Because I think that our biblical ancestors, they had it right. The order of the Seder night probably should have been eating, asking, and explaining, Not eating after we have had an hour and a half of Haggadah. Because in many cases, the Seder becomes something we speed through in order to get to the dinner. How fast can we get to the dinner? Without fail, this question is always asked, Now, I'm not suggesting we go back to the biblical order of things. We simply need to be patient enough to really taste, to savor the story before the meal. So we know what's led up to this, One way of doing this, by the way, I would suggest, is by telling people at the very beginning of the Seder of the night, how long the Seder up to the meal will be, up to the meal. Because as you know, that after the meal, in most cases, there is a real exodus. We commemorate the exodus. So people then are more prone to be tolerant. Second, the Seder should be more than just a mindless recitation of the Hebrew. And when we say Avadim Ayinu, what is it about? We were slaves, It's not just the recitation. Manishtana, what is it about, Manishtana? What does it mean? Let's talk about it. Let's explore why this night is different than all other nights. Again, this should be a time for getting together, not only to eat, but a time to get together to really appreciate what this holiday is all about. Many of us grew up at such Seders. I know that Seder, some uncles sitting at the head of the table and reading the Hebrew, but they understood, nobody else understood, We have to be mindful of the people who don't read Hebrew, who don't understand the Hebrew. Of course, the word Dayanus in Hebrew is a wonderful thing, but we should read as much of the Haggadah in the English. Why? In order, again, to promote discussion and conversation. And finally, let me say this, a Seder should not be childish and juvenile, although it is also a child's holiday. We do everything in order to encourage children to participate, to stay up, and to inquire. And children can be very inquisitive, as you all know, It's good to engage the children during the evening, So there's a lot of material online today and everything about Pesach and the different commentaries, and so much. I myself, I'm reading 2 books now that are things that, really learning about Pesach, the deeper meaning of everything about Pesach, So imagine an evening in which children and adults engage in a serious discussion. It's a wonderful thing, because children are inquisitive, they have an imagination. And then, in essence, bring the children up to our level rather than coming down to their level, Most cases, I'd say children doesn't like it when we speak to them. It's like baby talk, because, they should be spoken to as participants. And again, what happened when your child asks you, what is it? Why are we doing this? So the Seder can be joyous, funny, childish, and serious at the same time. What could be better than having our children listen to us talk about issues of the world and our values as Jews and as human beings, So I have a challenge for you for the Seder this year. Start reading the Haggadah now, Think about what it says. Pick 2 or 3 at the most sections that are especially meaningful to you, and formulate some questions and ideas. Maybe read a commentary or to discuss hundreds and thousands of them. And by all means, make the Seder fun and engagement. But don't be silly at the expense of its true meaning, Make your Seder, the challenge is make your Seder into a night of learning and conversation, And don't be afraid to make your Seder full of meaning. It's okay to have some fun, but fun shouldn't come at the expense of serious thinking or serious thought, Because how often do we have the opportunity to sit down to a serious conversation about ethics and faiths and identity, and the world around us, and what's happening in the world, and somehow apply this to our lives, to the Seder, Certainly you don't have to be a rabbi or a great scholar to make this happen, All you have to be is to be open to asking questions and listening to others, sometimes even if you disagree with them, and sharing a point of view. It's as easy as Pesach, Matzah, Umaro. Pesach, Matzah, Umaro. Any questions here? Because I can go on for 3 hours, and I really would like to have another hour of this. Maybe, what's today? How about Tuesday night? I'd love to go on. All right, who do we have on? So let's introduce ourselves over here. Go ahead. Can we open it? All right. Hello. Yeah. Who's this?
Oh, this is Richard. How are you, Rabbi?
Oh, Richard. How are you?
Fine. I have one question that has to do with wine.
Yes.
Does it matter whether on Pesach, if it's obviously it's got to be kosher wine, but what about does it have to be a mevushal or anything like that?
Well, I mean, the mevushal is that's a totally different thing. I mean, it's a whole thing. But you know what? If you can't have wine, have most wines are mevushal and some are not mevushal. The whole idea about mevushal is, it can be served it can be opened by people out of it, other than the people of the Jewish faith. So I'm not going to go into the whole idea of mevushal or not mevushal, but the idea is that it's better not to have mevushal, really. But every wine is kosher for Pesach. Everyone in Israel is kosher for Pesach. Most wines, kosher wines, by the way, are kosher for Pesach. Forget about the mevushal and no mevushal. And if you are allergic to wine, if you not have wine, by the way, you can have a grape juice. Grape juice. And it doesn't have to be full cups of wine. It has to be at least 3 ounces. Okay? So if you drank 3 ounces of wine, you have fulfilled the mitzvah of a cup of wine out of the 4.
Okay, I thought the Nebishal also was used to make sure that the yeast was filled.
Correct.
And wouldn't that be part of Pesach?
You're right, but everything is kosher for Pesach. All kosher wines are kosher for Pesach.
Okay. All right, that's good to
Kosher
know.
wine, yes. Go ahead.
I was wondering if you could maybe give a few examples of how specifically to engage children during the Seder without making it childlike. Like, do you have any suggestions
There
for
are many,
when
many wonderful ways of engaging children. And number one, the idea of Manishtana Halayla Zeh, when a child asks, why is it not different on all the nights? Why do you think? I mean, you can come up with wonderful questions and ways to engage the children, especially if they know that there's a present waiting for them at the end, there's so many wonderful traditions. They're not laws, they're traditions from different parts of the Jewish world. The Sephardic and the Ashkenazic, and among the Sephardic, there are 20 different traditions. For instance, I was once at the Seder where some Iranian Jews were there, and all of a sudden, right in the middle of the Seder, they took a bunch of scallions, and started hitting the children. Why? Because you'll smell the scallions, you'll stay up. That's the way they kept the children up. Because I looked at them and I said, why are you doing this? What is this, Mishigas? That's what it is. That's the way they did it. In fact, I have a book of the different Passover traditions from throughout the world, whether it's Kurdistan and Afghanistan, wherever Jews were, they had these traditions, and that came with them. And they're wonderful, wonderful traditions. But, there's so many ways. I know that Mara, my wonderful Mara, Steni's daughter, when we had Seders in the shul and everything, she made it a point that, let's say, the 10 plagues, they reenacted everything, with little toys and things like that looked like, and all of a sudden, you had the children engaged. There's so many ways. By the way, if you look at the internet, by the way, there are children's Haggadahs, and it tells you exactly. You don't need me to tell you this because you have 100 of those, children Haggadahs, and how to engage exactly, how to do and what to do in answer to your question.
Okay.
And listen, being creative helps a little bit, and there are people out there that they know what to do with the children, and they know how to keep their attention. How to keep their attention. The one thing we have to say at this time, you say Shechianu v'Kimanu, and remember the Kol Difrin and the other things we should remember now. If you want another one, I'll be more than happy to go and do it. But otherwise, if you have any questions, Gesundheit. And if you don't, it's 8:30. Huh?
Yes, Ron, it's 8:20.
A great time when you're having a great time. Look, again, there's so much to talk. There's so much, if I had to share with you, I'll need probably 25 hours of sharing with you, different commentaries and different ways of looking at things. And look at Rabbi Sachs, for instance, and there's so many Haggadot. There are thousands of Haggadot, written with commentaries by great rabbis, by great scholars. Certainly. So, if there's nothing else, have a wonderful, wonderful Pesach.
And
Wherever you are, enjoy yourselves, and you know how to make it interesting. Really, you really know how to do it. So I don't have to really tell you how to, because when you sit down to the table, that atmosphere, that ruach, the work of the Pesach Seder encourages and makes you. Okay. Anybody else? Valerie?
No questions. I don't know what to ask.
It's nice to see you.
Thank you.
Okay, are we done?
Yeah.
All right, have a wonderful season, Pesach. God bless you, and all the best in the world, and have a wonderful, wonderful Seder, and productive and a meaningful Pesach. God bless.
Thank you.
Hi, Cindy.
Thank you.